Hello, everyone, and welcome to the virtual launch for the very brilliant Entering Sappho by Sarah Dowling. My name is James Lindsay. I'm the Sales and Marketing Coordinator at Coach House Books, and I have the honor tonight of hosting this launch launch for Entering Sappho by Sarah Dowling, a book I'm very, very passionate and excited about. Before we get going, I just want to do a land acknowledgement first. Because we're hosting this event from Toronto, I'm going to do our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. All right. What can I say about Entering Sappho? It is a sort of meta-textual history book. It is about geography. It is about queerness and location and colonialism. It's about many, many different things. So I really don't see much time or much point in wasting time. Let's just jump into this. First of all, I'd like to introduce our writers. Obviously, first of all, we have Sarah Dowling. Sarah is the author of Down and the Security Posture, which received the Robert Koch Award for Innovative Poetry. A literary critic as well as a poet, Sarah's first scholarly work, Translingual Poetics, Writing Personhood Under Settler Colonialism, was a finalist for the American Studies Association Lauro Romano Prize. Sarah is an associate professor at the Center for Comprehensive Literature in Victoria College at the University of Toronto. And joining her tonight is Sonnet LeBay. Sonnet is a mixed-race Black writer, professor, organizer, emerging musician of Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese and Quebecois ancestry, and the author of 3 collections of poetry: A Strange Relief, Killanon, Sonnet Shakespeares. Sonnet Shakespeare was a Quill and Choir Book of the Year for 2019, was shortlisted for the Dorothy Livesey Poetry Prize and the Raymond Suster Award, and longlisted for the Pat Lowther Memorial Award. Their chapbook, Anemia Candensis, won the 2017 BP Nickel Chapbook Award. Sonnet lives in Vancouver Island and is a professor of creative writing at the writing and English at the Vancouver Island University. So without further ado, please welcome, I'm just checking my schedule, Sonnet LeBay.
Hello everybody. Ike Squale from Coast Salish, Hulkamanian speaking Nanaimo territory. I'm going to read 2 poems from Sonnets Shakespeare. I'm going to start with one that I think is timely because I wrote it right after the current US president got elected. This was not unimaginable to my brown fears. Brown folk grok the prophetic soul of the wide world, which downstreams white dreams banking on things to come. Now uncanny poets breathe pleas into the foamy truthscape. A slough of voters glommed control, the not supposed to have seized the pen. The civil sheen forfeits its command of our military complex offshore industrialized doom. There's a slip for the moment. The immortal moon watches earth weather eclipse itself. Undercurrents surface. The comedians and sad augurs mock their own prescient, cynical guesses. Insane certainties now crown themselves. We are assured a brand of peace. Protest cannot sully. Last night, we commoners watched as our livid selves peeled back the skin of an endless rage. One by one, win after win, the states clothed themselves in red. Shocked reporters read off the figures in failed, emotionless tones, in a disturbed calm, stunned by the unfolding cataclysm. The enemy was suddenly us, those we loved, those who look like us. The fresh wound to nice ladies' psyche, the death of their comfortable superiorities. As liberals cried, liberals saw their own race. In spite of him, we will have to live in this poor version of America, while he insults history and principle, roaring, dull, and fatal speech. Something elected this. Something tribal and scared, something branded and thugged. How, multitudes, can we, in this unreality show of alternative good, find each other? How long, liberty, will your monuments stand when a tyrant's cronies boast of civil liberty's ban? Poets drop their F-bombs in dissent, while official-lipped brass bands air kiss the next best president. Okay, I just jumped right into it because I was thinking of time, but most importantly, I'm like stoked to be here for Sarah and her cool meditations on place and naming and direction and subtler consciousness. This book, my book, I'm hoping that we have some interesting conversation. This book, I write over Shakespeare's sonnets. And so I didn't explain it for this reading, but inside each of the poems that I've read is buried a Shakespeare sonnet. And so this one I've never read before, and I'm going to read it because we're entering Sappho, and this is the one poem where I mention Sappho, and it's about me thinking about how the construction of muses and the idea of making inspiration into goddess figures and what that has meant literarily and what that means for a vagina-bodied poet to be thinking about their muses. And it turns out that this is actually this is an overwriting of a pretty famous sonnet. So I'll read the sonnet and then I'll read the poem about the muses so that you might hear the way that the two musics work together. So Sonnet 130 is this one, which you'll, I'm sure, recognize. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red, and if snow be white, why then her breasts are done. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks, and in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any, as she belied with false compare. Okay, so here is my poem. My muse, made by distress, has never met my eye. His glances return only the indifference that struggle mistakes for strength. Isn't a poet's muse an emotional construction, an ideal devised by fear of more red-blooded contact? The Romans got theirs from Delphi, practice, song, and memory, or else soundings of waters, air, and voice, wondered as beautiful women. The ancients knew that poetry moves through a body as resonance, as harmonies. The hero's brave accomplishments, a girl's rare decorum, the scent of loosestrife and hyacinth, are but subjects to the wind in the poet lyre. The muse ennobles the hack. Without euterpe, song is mere howling. Sans Melpomene, Heroes' heads roll without grace. What vibes temper a versifying personality? That's the question disarmed by imagining skills as goddesses, genres as goddesses. We're aiming towards ideals always. Maybe Hesiod tried to fill a youthful, nymph-shaped hole in his unconscious. Maybe Homer and Herodotus sheepishly beseeched Calliope and Clio in the very voice Humbert Humbert used to invoke the seraphic nakedness of his nymphette. All wisdom and knowledge personified as sublime sisters is heroine craft I'm down for, wherever delight and thankfulness for feminine authority are its root. Sappho's fragmented breath that comes down to us from Mytilene made her mistress of the Greeks. I love to hear her poems speak, enthused Plato, who hyped her as the 10th muse. But Sappho dug women and allured when invoking the muses, dropping wows on their hair. Flattering femme muses isn't my shtick. I'm no Athenian, no forefather inflamed by virgin whore Pleiads, no modern painter goddessing young ladies after gallery galas. In fact, I never saw a goddess for whom I'd go to my knees. I'm my own mistress. But when I sigh, a perfect knowledge hears me. Surely, I invoke the perfect listener who reads my expressions without error, who gets my ninja warrior illusions, oh my God, some idealized blend of dad and boyfriend, with whom my throbbing psyche craves communion. Everything I seek is inside myself: love, understanding, security, say relationship experts. So, anybody in there? Listener? Hello? Something bodied listens, eyes down, awaiting the hard cuff of false compare. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sonnet. That was really, really great. And yeah, now reading from her second collection, Entering Sappho, Sarah Dowling.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much, Sonnet, for your reading. I had this whole idea of how I was going to start off with this like shticky poetry joke of needing to put on my poetry hat. But then I realized not only does it say Sappho backwards, and none of you would be able to tell what it says, it looked like I was the Grim Reaper when I put it on. So I'm skipping that. I really love the poem that Sonnet read, that the second one, that made reference to these kind of strange ideals. That's very much at the heart of my project. Entering Sappho really began from, well, first it began from a road sign on Highway 101 in Washington State that says Entering Sappho on it. But I became really interested in this phenomenon that's much more pronounced in the US of naming towns and settlements after persons, places, and things from ancient Greece. And I thought that there was a very interesting way that that kind of asks us to relate to these settlements that sort of plays on our own ideals and relationships to classical Greece and sort of directs us away from what actually happens with settlement. So I'm going to read a few different pieces from the book to kind of give you a flavor for the way I go about this. But basically what all of them do is they splice together archival records related to the town of Sappho, which no longer exists at all, poems by Sappho, and then these kind of strange bits and bobs of sort of personal investment of some of the kind of queer affects of ancient Greece. So the very first one I'll read is from a poem called Oral History. And I'll just launch right in. It's about how the town got its name. Oral History. She was reading a book, I think it was. She was a Greek. I don't know, or I don't remember. It was in a play, or well, no, she's one of the characters. But anyway, her name was Sappho. Oh. So they was building the old place over there and the store and the hotel, and you get the post office, so they named that Sappho. So that's where Sappho was originally named, how it got its name, reading that book. So that is pretty much verbatim from an actual oral history with someone who grew up in this town and whose in-laws were among the original settlers. And what really struck me about this interview was that he knew nothing about Sappho at all. And for me, that was this incredible freedom that I didn't need to be bound to some version of the truth, that instead these sort of piecemeal and partial identifications could license any number of different ways of bringing these different histories together and using Sappho's sort of breathless desire to overtake and possess as a way of thinking really seriously about what actually happened in these places. So the next little bit I want to read is from right at the beginning of the book. It's called Clip, and it's some poetry of Sappho, some imagery from Sappho's poems, some newspaper articles from around the time that Sappho really went into decline, the town that is. And this is sort of how the entire book begins. Clip. Monday, May 15, Sappho, Washington. A logging chapter is closed. Those country maidens were good riders, flowers blooming in an old bathtub, cows grazing in an orchard, garments wet as they should be. Across the dirt road, peasant girls on the front porch, a town of 5 houses. Oh, anyone would want to live in the fenced area nearby. Anyone, wet dress around her feet. Her dress about her ankles, an old bathtub. In the front yard, horses munch grass. What wench, country fried at the side of the highway, has electricity, television, a telephone? Oh, it's for the birds. What rustic girl plans to enter her prize quarter horse in races this summer? She's never known anything but logging trucks. She doesn't even draw her gown across her feet. Waterflowers bloom, country girls turn north at Sappho, go to Pisht, spend time darning holes in wool socks and wondering, why would anyone pull rags over her ankles? What girl wants to live in nearness to fishing? What country girl is unspoiled nature? Young mothers by choice, they hear about it 3 days later. They still don't pull the cloth over their feet. Down Highway 101 apiece, what country girl says you can do these things in cities? Small town life is all I want to know. They front on the old houses for truckers and tourists, tearing down the last of the company shacks. What girl waits like a wife for wet attackers, spinning yarns from her country dress? Oh, that girl gathers it up with artless grace. You can still see a girl's feet at Sappho. You can see the owner of the company store. Those girls would sit eating clams, soft blossoms, simple dresses in a line on the ground. Maybe loggers and their families shot deer, bear, elk, some girl in the area. Why would anyone want to live when May 1 the post office closes forever? Those girls lay claim to time, backward and forward, their hemlines sweeping the ground. So that kind of backward and forward sweeping imagery that I drew from Sappho was one way that I really wanted to think about the movement from past to present and the relationship to these different moments in history that I wanted to think through and kind of cultivate in the present. And one of the things that really struck me the most about the archival text that I was working with was how they never seemed to narrate anything particularly bad happening, but they had this real kind of violent ambiance. And I thought that was actually really important to try to zero in on, this like constant sense that they were always like armed to the teeth, waiting for something bad to happen and causing bad things to happen as a result. So in this poem that I'm going to read a slightly longer section from, Us, that was really what I was trying to focus on. Us. You may forget, but I remember well one day how thrilled I was when I took little Annie Schofield by the hand, a blood-red rose flaming with all the long-buried passions of the South. I had many dolls, but my favorite was a lady in a red dress. I helped her along from rock to rock in the shallow water at the river's edge. In the pale Gothic garden, there burst something you may forget, but our minds worked overtime on what we would like to have. After a great deal of coaxing, I called her my little red girl. You may forget, but occasionally the law has its revenge, and I had been promised. The intoxicating odor had become a delicate perfume. You may forget, but I remember well the shallow water, the river's edge, how thrilled I was when I helped her by the hand, took her along from rock to rock, little red-haired Annie Schofield there, how I was flaming, a blood-red rose. Let me tell you that I might have lost myself. Let me tell you about this terrible red gash across my face. You may forget, but Mr. Gorder, who was youthful and spry in spite of his long red beard, was cruising out of his claim one day. He lay silent but breathing, unconscious, and with his big 44 strapped to his side. You may forget, but Dor was a strong boy, and let me tell you this about the long-buried passions of the South. Let me tell you about their intoxicating odor, which becomes a delicate perfume. Let me tell you, I had many dolls, but my favorite was a lady in a red dress, and I called her my little Rose of Lesbos. Let me tell you how she turned a pallid pink and then bloomed and withered all unseen. The children colored red boots. They came by mail from Tacoma. The children colored that up. You may forget that one day with my little red girl in my pretty boots when they came by mail from Tacoma. I had been cruising out of my claim. I had been promised roses of Lesbos. I had turned a pallid pink. I had been promised a beard. I was youthful and spry in spite of this, and you may forget, but my brother Elmer was to bring me dolls which I would dash on the rocks. After a great deal of coaxing, someone in some future time will call this my little red fancy, my passionate edge. You may forget, but occasionally the pretty boots have their revenge, and I had been promised. Mr. Gorder, who was from Pishton, and I waited for some future children. I thought of them on the riverbank, dancing up and down, their delicate breathing, their intoxicating 44. I lay silent but breathing, unconscious, and let me tell you this big Gothic rose was strapped to my side. Let me tell you that I might have lost myself. Let me tell you about my favorite who was wearing a dress and pretty little boots, my pretty red boots. Let me tell you this, I have been promised. Let me tell you how I rocked her in the shallow red of the river water. Someone in some future time will think how thrilled I was. Someone in some future time will think we lay silent but breathing, that my favorite was unconscious. You may forget that I'm a big, strong boy. You may forget that I had many dolls. Let me tell you this about long-buried possession. Let me tell you about the sound. I waited among red lilies, hollering and strapped with this, a big 44 at my side. Let me tell you about this intoxicating odor. Let me tell you how she was to bring me. I had many dolls, but my favorite was a dewy riverbank, and I called her my little unconscious, and I called her my wet prairie. Let me tell you how I helped her blossom by the hand. Let me tell you about the roses. Let me tell you about Lesbos, where we lay silent but breathing, pallid and pink. Let me tell you how I was strapped to her side. After a great deal of coaxing, I called her and then bloomed. I called her and then withered. I called her all unseen. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you so much for being here this evening, and I look forward to discussing everything with everyone. Thanks, everybody.
Sarah, that was absolutely incredible. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Sonnet to come back too now because we're going to have a little chat. Before we get going, though, two things. First thing, if you have any questions for Sarah or Sonnet, please drop them into the chat and we'll try to get to them when we can. Secondly, if you have not picked up Entering Sappho yet, we are running a special deal tonight. If you check out at the Coach House website using the code SAPPHO, all caps, you can get 25% off this book. This code's good until tomorrow night at midnight, so don't delay. Maybe Tally can drop a link for the book in the website. Bam, thank you very much. Yeah, let's get going. First of all, thank you both so much for your readings. They were really great. One thing I wanted to touch on first right away, Sarah, for you, was you gave us a bit of the history of Sappho, which is amazing. But I was hoping you could give us a bit of your personal history with Sappho. I remember you sharing a picture of you standing in front of the road sign. And obviously the town has certain implications for the name as well. So I was wondering just how you discovered this town, first of all, what drew you to write about it?
Thanks for that, James. So I used to live in Seattle. I lived there for quite a long time. That was where I had my first academic job. And not too long after I moved there, I was speaking to one of my colleagues, the fiction writer Rebecca Brown, and she was telling me kind of the cool, interesting local places to go. And she said that a really wonderful place to spend some time and to spend one's money was to go to the Quileute Oceanside Resort, which is owned by the Quileute Nation. And they have these like very nice little cabins that are right along the ocean, and it's absolutely beautiful. And she said, you know, this is a great place to get writing done. So I thought, great idea, I'd love to do it. And as we were discussing this, she said, oh, and by the by, when you're driving out there, you're going to see the entering Sappho sign. And, you know, you have to like do your debt to queer history, and you have to pull over and like take a selfie in front of it. And she told me that there was something kind of along the lines of the lesbian herstory archives that had been in Seattle in the past that's not there anymore. And they had like a whole collection of pictures of people in front of this sign, like over the decades, often making like crude gestures or whatever. And that this was sort of like a thing that people do. And so I should definitely do it as well. So, you know, when my partner and I and our friend Tara and our dog Zoe went out there, we stopped and we took our pictures. And it was like really scary because there's not much of a shoulder. So the cars are just like zipping by. But it's like this really strange kind of gleeful moment because the sign is like so funny, but there's absolutely nothing there. There's not like a single building remaining. But there was just something to me about that kind of like gleeful excitement of like connecting to one history that like allows you to entirely jump out of another much more immediate one. Like Sappho is not even there anymore, but that is like so much more apparent, and so much like the experience to have. And there was something about that collision to me that I was just like, I want to think about this a lot more. I think this is kind of an interesting window into something that I've probably been like trying to think about for my whole life, that, you know, thinking about maybe why I actually live here and how that happened. Maybe this would be a way to do that, where I can sort of think about the fantasies and the investments, and the ways that I can like make things disappear by making other excitements reappear. That it seemed like this place that doesn't exist anymore might actually allow that to happen in a way that, say, like writing about Regina, where I'm from, and Queen Victoria, like one could, but it didn't seem as immediate to me how I might. So it seemed like this kind of place that no longer exists might allow me to sort of think through some of these things that everything about our world makes it easy not to think about.
That was amazing. I like, but you know, every time people talk about poetry prompts, it's usually like a beautiful picture of a butterfly landing on a dewy flower. So
I
really
wouldn't torture you with any poem like that from me.
This next question is for both Sonnet and Sarah. One thing that I found common between both of your books is you're using a lot of text. Obviously, Sonnet, you're using Shakespeare's sonnets, and Sarah, you have a lot of used a lot of interviews and historical material as well that was in there. I was hoping both of you could talk a little bit about what's like writing poetry, especially book-length projects, where you're utilizing so much of other texts, and how you go about gathering that, and what you use, what you choose to discard, just anything like that. Sonnet, maybe you could get us started this time.
Sure. Well, I once I had the text that I wanted to use, I was looking for, at the time I was looking for kind of text that would be the source material, raw material thing, that like material of like colonial education, British canon forming, et cetera, And so once I chose the sonnets for a number of reasons, including my own very personal connection to that form, then I knew what I had. So, and I didn't want to discard any of it. For me, my book, the process was to use absolutely every letter of it. And I think that that provided a framework, it provided direction, it made it very clear where I was headed in some ways. And I would say one of the more interesting things was sometimes just confronting what is actually there in the archive, like, because I was confronting representations of darkness, the dark lady and blackness, and just really sitting with how longstanding these associations and images was part of my experience of sitting with that very generative work.
Thank you. Sarah, what was your experience like?
Well, I didn't start by knowing which texts I was going to engage with, and I thought at the beginning that it would just be the archive related to Sappho, the town, which is not in any way assembled because it was never an important place. So it was like having to find a few newspaper references here and having to find a few interviews there. And that was actually nice because it meant it didn't get too expansive. But I just found it really hard to have anything much to say about it because I didn't want to just like make fun of these rural people, because the whole point was that they were doing something that I'm kind of still doing, right? So there was no sense in trying to just be superior and point out like how silly they were for not really knowing very much about Sappho or something like that. So it wasn't until I started engaging more closely with her poetry, which came actually like semi late in the process, that I kind of found a way in. And to sort of make reference to Steve Collis's question, there wasn't any one particular translation that I was using. I was actually using as many different translations as I could find. I came across this really great book, which is in French, but it's 100 different versions of poem 31, which is Sappho's jealousy poem. And the earliest one, I think, is Louise Labbé. And then it goes all the way up to the present. And they're all like so different. Like some of them are prose poetry, some of them are metrical, some of them are free verse. It's like totally different lengths, but they just cycle over these same images, and that's what they have in common. And sort of seeing that and seeing them all back to back together, I was kind of like, okay, like I can do that. It was very like patchworky in that sense. So like certain poems, I'll use like very similar little phrases as ways to kind of open and end different thoughts. Other poems are basically just like that book. It's kind of like, on the one hand, a condensation, on the other hand, an expansion of poem 31. But for me, it was kind of like putting all these different approaches together. How does that give us kind of a series of different views on this other archive?
What I found interesting about both of your books is that obviously there's a bit of humor in the title for both, which really draws you in, but both are dealing with colonialism and text in different ways, and you're sort of almost pardon me for saying this, but like colonializing texts themselves again by sort of reusing them and populating them however you want, which leads me to the first question from the audience that I'd like to ask. Devia Victor says, Sarah, this is for you at Sonnet. I'd love to hear your take on this as well. She'd like to hear you talk about your rhythm and pace and composition, especially since so much of the language is archival and borrowed. How do you think about these concerns?
Do you want to start, Sonnet? Me? Okay. Thanks for the question, Dev. It's very nice to know that you're really here. For me, the most difficult thing about writing a poem is kind of finding the rhythm and finding the pace of it, because I write by reading aloud a lot. And I so often find as I'm trying to do that, that whatever I think I've done is completely wrong and I have to go back to square one. And I think what I really found in using this material, that the thing that worked the best was to really focus on the repetition with a difference that I was seeing across the translational history with Sappho, and to use that repetition with a difference as a way of looking at the other archive related to the town. That like that kind of stopping and starting and looking again that characterizes the history of translating Sappho's work and kind of reinventing it as you go along was the thing that allowed me to like figure out what to look at and figure out how much to look at it in the colonial archive. So it doesn't quite come out as like pace and rhythm, but in the end that was the effect for me. It was like going back over it over and over again. That was what I needed to do to write it, but that was also what I needed the poems to do for the person reading them, or for them just to be what they were.
Sonnet, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm working in such a different way with the source text. For me, I often could not repeat, like I could not repeat words just because the constraint that I'd given myself was to use the letters that were there, and so it just made it impossible to do that. So there are a lot of I made a choice, for example, to make a lot of lists in the book. There are times where I like basically like kind of list 15 words or 20 words, and that was a very specific kind of rhythm that got introduced then by doing that, and that was very much came out of the constraint itself. It just felt like a big win to be able to actually name the things I wanted to name using the letters that I had. So some of those choices were things that I would just probably not have done if I'd had the freedom of a full lyric. So that was one thing that happened that way.
Okay, this is another question for both of you. Given that your poems deal with American locations, themes, topics, how does your Canadianness, in quotes there, manifest itself in your work, consciously or unconsciously?
You know, I'm not sure. That's a great question. I didn't know if I would get to come back here ever. So I thought at the time that I started this project that, you know, I was working in the US, I was married to an American, my kid was American, like I should just get over myself and engage with the place that I actually live. And then it was a big surprise that I actually had the opportunity to move back. But aside from those sort of like personal circumstances, I actually think that like this book is about US places, but it's like questions that are being asked more so in Canada. And I think that has slightly changed over the amount of time that I was writing the book, and is very like regionally specific in the US. I think in some parts of the US, like people are obviously talking about these things as well. But certainly when I started writing the book, I was like really following the conversation around like I'll know more. I was really following what was happening with the TRC report, and as I think a lot of us have been, like really trying to think seriously and carefully about my own like complicity in this atrocious history, and what it means to relate to it in a way that goes beyond just kind of hand-wringing. So that was a conversation that at that point in time, I didn't really see happening in the US as much. So even though actually in Canada, there are very few places that are named after classical Greece, there's like Ajax, Ontario, but there's really hardly any. The naming patterns for whatever reason are very different here. So even though that's quite different. I think the set of concerns comes much more out of conversations that were happening in Canada than in the US.
Sonnet, I know your text doesn't necessarily have to directly to do with America, but do you have anything to add to that as well?
Well, I think that Canadianness has been a concern of mine from my like childhood, because that was the term under which the multicultural narrative of like my eventual belonging, always in the future, right? Was told to me, and I was like, this Canadian story, this is a story, and Canada is the container for it. So I've been thinking about that basically my whole life. But I would say that in this book, some of those the concerns that Sarah articulated around like moving from a position of earlier basically thinking of myself as speaking from a margin to a center, but more now thinking about what places am I on, and what is my relationship as, descended from people who were moved to this place. Like, what is my relationship to the land beneath me? I know right now the book is only out in Canada, but I feel as though the conversations are still relevant for anyone thinking through the coloniality of the country that they identify with and have a passport for.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience. Sarah, this is for you. This is from Dana Middleton. Oh, I just lost this. When you were doing your research on Sappho in the area on the peninsula, were there any historical accounts or events that didn't make it into your work, but you've continued to process adjacent to the work?
Hi, Dana. Thanks for tuning in. It's nice to get a little snippet of your voice out of the void. There weren't really any like full-length kind of interesting stories that didn't really make it in. There were some oral histories that I didn't end up transcribing the entire thing, mostly just because the people whose histories were being recorded, their voices were very hard to understand. So it was extremely laborious. So I tried to just be like very selective, and when I did record something from them, to just kind of like use it very extensively. A lot of what I ended up cutting out though was like, there were all these like really silly details that were like really, really funny. Like James was saying, there is this kind of weird element of humor that's shot through, and I probably could have riffed on that forever, but it just seemed like that was actually the problem, right? The gleeful posing in front of the sign in the first place could have just been endless. So actually like scaling back on all those sort of ridiculous and silly little details, like just to give one example of one thing that does somewhat stand out to me. So in Sappho, when it was in its heyday, there was this cafe for loggers that was like kind of the one thriving business in town. And the family that operated it, there wasn't like a daycare in the town. So they just would like put their baby in the plate glass window as kind of a display. And then they could like keep their eye on it, and it would like attract customers. And I thought that was like very funny, but it also had like nothing to do with anything. So sometimes I just sort of think of it and chuckle, but it didn't like give me any special insight, or, it served no purpose to the project, but it was interesting.
And there are points that felt, and I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but almost a little House on the Prairie-ish, like there's sort of this like you really captured that text way of almost this innocent naivety about settlers,
Yeah.
Right from the piece you read about, in particular about the little girl and her doll. I remember you saying, sorry, I don't know, I spoke over you there.
No, that's okay. I mean, that was actually an element that really interested me with a lot of the archival material that existed, was that so much of it was stuff that people remembered from when they were kids. So it had this very like nostalgic quality to it, and this really like rose-colored glasses aspect. But actually, because they were children, that was like so on the surface. And I don't think it's like unique to the things that children remember. Like that actually is a structure of how we talk about settlement, is like, and then like this wonderful thing happened, like Little House on the Prairie. So these stories that were told from this kind of childlike perspective, they weirdly brought that out in such a more overt way that like over the top kind of fantasy aspect was so much easier to access. And that really interested me. And also because they like understood things somewhat imperfectly, like the jump from that kind of rose colored glasses perspective to like some really like horrible event happening was like very quick. So a certain amount of the compression that I think I would have been interested in doing was kind of already there in the archive.
Here's a question for both of you. After engaging with text this closely, this intimately for an extended period of time while you're writing and preparing to write, how do you feel about them afterwards? But by the end, were you just sick, like Sonnet? Were you just done with Shakespeare forever after that? Sarah, were you just like, by the time you were done your manuscript, you're just like, I don't ever want to read another settler account ever again, or not? I'm curious to see how your relationship with the text is after your book.
For me, I was working so closely with it in some ways that I didn't see it. It was like kind of like being like working with a digital image and being like right up in the pixels, right? So to back up and look at what I'd engaged with, I think by the end of it, I was just more. I thought a lot more about lineages and a lot more about inheritance and the parts of the sonnets that I hadn't maybe paid as much attention to, about like having sons and the encouragement to like have more white children, basically, is one of the things that I was left with. I'm not sick of them though.
Did you enjoy Shakespeare's sonnets beforehand? Is that what actually drew it to you, or did you find, was there something?
I spent like I was 7 years old. I would read them. I was trying to do like critical exegesis at 7. I don't know why. Like, I just had them, and they had my name on them. And I was a kid who really wanted to understand books, and so I spent a lot of time with them when I was like 7 and 8. And then again in high school, when I was in computer programming class, I like made a program that like would bring up the sonnets, like you could put the number in and it would bring it. Like, yeah, I've been, I don't know, engaging with them off and on. Yeah.
Well,
and you know, when you're all alone and heaven is not listening to your bootless cries, it's the place to go.
Sarah, how about you? How do you feel with the texts you were working with now?
Well, in terms of the Sappho texts, I may have a few students lurking out there in the Zoom, and they will know that we will be reading Sappho very soon. And I have rarely taught Sappho's work before. Like occasionally I'd bring in a few fragments for creative writing, but it wasn't something where I was like really like read this in advance and think about it deeply. So I was saying to my partner earlier, like, well, I don't know that much about Sappho. And she was like, yeah, you do. So I still have this sort of sense that like, oh, it could just be this like, you know, endless thing that I would never get to the bottom of. Like, I'm a total newbie. I still feel that way. So we'll see. I think it will be interesting to talk about it with other people.
Forgive me if I'm just plain wrong about this, but does anyone know that much about Sappho? I feel like Sappho, like part of the appeal is that they are unknowable, really, right?
Right. Yeah, like pretty much everything we know is not very certain. So I think that's great. I find that, one of the most appealing things. So, and also there's constantly new things discovered. Like, even though she's like the first lyric poet, we still find new poems that we can realize are the ones that are being referenced that we didn't have before. Like in 2014, a complete poem was found that we knew that it existed because there's like descriptions of it in other writings by other ancient authors, but then we didn't have it for like, millennia, and now we have it again. So that's really fascinating to me. Like, even the amount of texts that are attributable to her reliably varies hugely from one point in time to another. So what we even think she wrote is completely variable.
Amazing. Next question here. This is from Claire Lacey. It's a question for both poets. How does your poetry sit with you more, with your more academic work and writing? What does poetry allow you to do that either complements or contracts, or contracts your more scholarly engagements with texts?
Sonnet, do you want to start on that one?
I'll just say briefly that I feel like poetry has always given me permission to play with genre. I'm thinking of something that I wrote for Steve Collis and Jacket too. Like, it was basically like a big poem that went to the end of went to the full margin. And that, I think that's the main thing for me, is feeling as though I'm not necessarily constrained by the genre of the academic essay always. Has been one way that poetry informs my academic thinking.
Yeah, I agree with that. I feel quite similarly. I also think like poetry is a good way to read. It's a good way to learn how to pay attention. It's a good way to direct your attention. So sometimes it is actually a good way to start a scholarly project, because it sort of attunes you to things that, if you are sort of looking through the lens of a particular theory or methodology, you're looking at like only one set of things. But if you're looking at a text as a poet, you can look at whatever you want. It sort of licenses you to pay attention in a different way, which can sometimes be a much more sort of intimate way. I think this is kind of one of the things that you were saying earlier about Shakespeare's sonnet. Like, if we read them as literary critics, we see one set of concerns, but if we read them as just intimate readers, suddenly we can notice all kinds of other things. So for me, it's like a different kind of attunement, I guess.
Okay, we have one more question from the audience. I think we'll wrap it up after this. I'd like to thank everyone very much. These have been some really, really great questions. I was wondering if anything stood out about the experience of transporting these events and words from the past into a present context. You're both working with poems and texts from times when language was used differently than it is now, with different vocabulary and conventions and so on, and making more modern poems from them, whatever that means. What was that like?
Do you want to go first?
I'll go first, definitely, so that you can have the last word too.
Oh.
I think that for me, what I liked to do was set contemporary words against like recognizable fragments of antiquated language in ways that had us think about the long roots of the language that we're using, and I'm the kind of person who's always thinking about etymology, but I'm imagining readers who do and don't, and to say remind people about the ways of listening to the word fair was really exciting to me. I like doing that. So there were lots of words. There was lots of words that I hoped that we got to think about again by doing that.
Yeah, I think I feel similarly. Like, there's something kind of eye-opening, I guess, to use just a very like basic term about putting kind of seemingly antiquated words together with seemingly contemporary ones. It like makes both of them look very different in ways that are really exciting. I also think it's very surprising how often these texts that we think of as being so kind of out of time and from another era and another world, once you pay a bit more attention to them, they seem strikingly contemporary in certain ways. Like, not always, but you know, there'll be like certain turns of phrase or certain images that are like too daring for us now in this funny way. And I think there's something about that that's really surprising. You know, like it's easy to believe like, oh, we've seen it all before and what did those guys know? And then you actually read it closely and you're like, oh, geez, wow, okay. Like these older things, they have this incredible purchase on the present that it's easy to forget. So to me, there's something very exciting about that as well.
Thank you both very much. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sonnet. Buy Shakespeare's Sonnet, Sonnets Shakespeare. Buy Sonnet's book. Buy Sarah's book, Entering Sappho. 25% off until tomorrow at midnight when you use the code Sappho, all caps. I can't thank you both enough for this. It was a really great conversation, even just for myself. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us tonight. Congratulations, Sarah. It's a very beautiful, brilliant book.
Yeah, congratulations, Sarah. Great book. Everybody buy it.
Thank you for reading with me, Sonnet. It's been so great to be here with you in space.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, James.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.